Whether you're looking to learn new tree painting techniques so that you can improve your watercolor landscapes, or you're simply looking for an exercise to help you continue developing your water and brush control, your color mixing, and other essential skills, this tutorial is for you. In this step-by-step watercolor tutorial, I am taking you through my entire process for a pair of fall trees. I'm sharing everything from my pencil sketch all the way to layering watercolor for depth and detail. Along the way, I am sharing my favorite techniques and everything that I make sure to do to arrive at believable results and trees that have dimension and glow to them. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica and I'm a traditional media artist working with a range of traditional drawing and painting mediums. Here on my channel, I share videos on sketching, watercolor, artist mindset, and from time to time, I also share videos on starting and growing an art business. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to subscribe. It's completely free. I share new videos every single week, and I would absolutely love to have you join this friendly art community. It means a lot to me, and it does a lot to help ensure that I can keep creating these videos to share with you. With all that said, let's jump in. Let's get started with a simple pencil sketch. I am using an HB drawing pencil and I'm making sure to keep my drawing light so that I can continue erasing mistakes and refining my drawing as I go. When it comes to sketching organic natural elements like trees, it is important to keep a symmetry and irregularity in mind. If our tree ends up being too symmetrical or perfect, whether it's in the tree trunk or branches or in the leaf portion itself, your tree at the end is likely not going to look very natural or believable. So if you find yourself creating perfect symmetry or any sort of pattern throughout the tree, stop and correct that before moving forward. And you might even find it helpful to observe reference photos of real trees so that you can observe and really get a better feel for all of that irregularity throughout. Oftentimes, as we're drawing, our brains will automatically revert back to doing everything in the simplest way it knows how, especially if we haven't drawn something very much before or we're not observing references. And symmetry, as well as keeping everything very straight and horizontal or vertical, is going to make things look a little bit too stiff and unnatural. A couple of things that I make sure to do when sketching my tree trunks and my branches are starting with a larger circumference at the base of that tree trunk and making my tree trunk at least a little bit more narrow as I'm making my way upward. And I also make my branches more and more tapered or narrow as I'm making my way away from the central tree trunk. Because we're going to be painting two trees today, and one of them is slightly covering the one in the back, especially when it comes to the leaf portion, you want to make sure that you understand the shapes of your leaves and how much of the leaves of the tree in the back are going to be covered by the one in the front. And if you need to erase any pencil lines, go ahead and do that before starting with your painting process so that you don't end up getting confused. I added in an irregular line for some grasses under these trees as well. And if you need to lighten certain sections of your sketch that might have gotten a little bit too dark, you can gently tap your kneadable eraser over these areas to lighten them. For this little painting, I'm going to be using 3 different round brushes in sizes 14, 6, and 3. And before jumping into the painting process, I do want to swatch out these colors that I'm going to be using for you on this scrap piece of paper so that you can see what they look like and you can just replace whatever you don't have with something that is similar. You never have to use exactly my same colors in order to arrive at great results. Just as an FYI, the paint that I have in this palette is a combo of paint from Daniel Smith and Winsor & Newton's Professional line. The first color that I swatched out for you is New Gamboge, which is a warm yellow. If you don't have New Gamboge, you could use something like Azo Yellow Deep, Hansa Yellow Deep, or Indian Yellow. The second color is Quinacridone Burnt Orange, which you can easily replace with Burnt Sienna. This next chocolatey brown is burnt umber. If you don't have burnt umber, you could use Mars brown, Van Dyke brown, transparent brown oxide, or even sepia. And then I'm gonna swatch out this dark brown color mixture that I created by mixing together burnt umber and a little bit of ultramarine blue. This next beigey golden neutral is raw sienna. If you don't have raw sienna, you could use quinacridone gold, transparent yellow oxide, or yellow ochre. Or simply create lighter versions of your brown by mixing in your warm yellow into your brown. I can mix in different amounts of raw sienna into the burnt umber to get in lighter and darker browns. And finally, the green that I'm using to paint the grass is Undersea Green from Daniel Smith. This is a warm, deep, rich, granulating green. If you don't have undersea green, you could use sap green, olive green, green apatite, or even hooker's green, or any warmer green. All right, a couple of quick tips before moving forward. Choose colors that will allow you to develop the range of values that is going to help you create dimension in your trees. This is why I chose the colors that I did. Why I brought in the lights, the mediums, and the darks. This is going to enable me to create lighter areas, mid-tone areas, and darker areas. If you don't consider what colors you're going to use to create your darker values, your mid-tones, and your darkest darks, you can very easily create a flat or heavy-looking painting. So make sure that you're setting yourself up for success by planning the colors that you're going to be bringing in. And finally, because these trees are overlapping, we want to make sure that the leaf portions don't merge together. And to do this, I'm going to be painting the leaf portion of the tree that is closer to us, the shorter tree, lighter than the tree in the back. This is going to help me create a difference in color so that we can more easily tell where one leaf portion ends and the other begins. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using more of that yellow, the new gamboge, and the lighter colors in the tree in the front, and I'm going to be using more of the reddish brown and the darker browns in the tree in the back. And I'm also going to be developing a bit of a shadow effect in between the leaf portions of these trees to create a greater tonal contrast and be able to keep these leaves from merging together visually. Before starting to paint, I decide that the sun is going to be hitting these trees from the upper right. This means that the majority of my lighter values are going to be in the upper right, and my larger, darkest shadow shapes are going to be on the lower left, opposite to the light source. This doesn't mean that I don't create mid-tones and darker values in the upper portions. It just means that I use my darker colors less in these areas. Starting with my size 14 round brush and the lightest color that I'm going to be using in this tree, which is the new gamboge. I'm going to make my way incrementally toward my darkest color. I'm painting on dry paper, so I'm making sure to keep it moving. Right here, I have already started with my second color, which is my quinacridone burnt orange. And sometimes I'm dropping in a little bit of this second color over my new gamboge while it's still wet, which creates soft effects. And in other cases, I am embracing the sharper edges that painting on dry paper creates. I'm really playing with my brush, using it in different angles, pressing it down to different degrees, and doing a little bit of scumbling or even scribbling, using just the tip of my brush as I'm making my way out. One very important thing is to leave little gaps or unpainted sections throughout the leaves. We're going to be painting branches later on in these areas. I'm starting to add in burnt umber into the quinacridone burnt orange, and I'm using it in this way in those sections opposite to the light source to darken them even more. And you can see how I'm creating these soft wet on wet effects because I am dropping in paint over a layer that is still wet. Certain sections are already starting to dry, and I am careful with those areas, really making sure that I'm not overly applying or layering on paint in areas that are starting to dry, because I don't want to create splotchiness or backgrounds or anything like that. All right, I've arrived at a nice variety in both hue and value throughout the leaves. It is time to let that dry. And in the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead and start painting the first layer in the tree trunk and some sections of the branches. I'm not really painting the branches just yet because in order to paint the branches, I need the leaves to be fully dry. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to paint wet on dry defined shapes for those tree branches. But I can certainly paint in the branch sections that are outside of the leaf area that I just painted, or in those little gaps which were left unpainted as well. To paint the tree trunk and the branches, I am using my size 3 round brush, and I first went in with my raw sienna, which is that lightest beigey golden brown, and then I added a little bit of burnt umber into the raw sienna to darken it so that I could start developing a bit of a range of brown values in these areas. I'm using shorter, more vertical strokes as I am painting the tree trunk to help me create the texture of wood. And I even left little slivers of paper unpainted because I know that this will also help me develop that texture. Before allowing this to dry completely, I'm just finishing up by adding little sections of branches in those gaps throughout the leaves. After everything was completely dry, it was time to do the same layering in the tree in the back. I switched on back to my size 14 round brush to get started. I want to make this tree at least a little bit darker than the tree in the front. So I make sure to go in with my quinacridone burnt orange so that that can be my lightest color instead of the new gamboge which I used for the first tree. And then I gradually move on to developing darker colors and darker values. I add more and more burnt umber into the quinacridone burnt orange to continue darkening it until I'm pretty much just using burnt umber. Continuing to have in mind that the light source is above these trees and to the right. And then at the very end, when I'm looking to push the darkest darks, I start adding ultramarine blue into the burnt umber. This allows me to create an even darker brown, which I use in those darkest areas that I'm looking to push the contrast in. And you're going to notice that I also drop in a little bit of this darkest brown that I created by adding ultramarine blue into the burnt umber in the rightmost edge where this tree connects with the other tree. This helps create a sensation of shadow in between these two trees, which will also help visually separate them. All right, so I'm just finishing up here by doing a little bit of lifting using the clean and only slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge. If at any time you feel you've darkened an area way too much, simply remove that paint from your paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water by dabbing the tip of your brush on your absorbent towel, and press down those bristles so that they can absorb excess color in those areas. Of course, in order to do this, your paint still needs to be wet. Once I was happy with my range in hues and values throughout the leaves, it was time to switch to my size 3 round brush to start painting in the tree trunk and visible parts of those branches. And here I'm starting to add some burnt umber into the raw sienna to create some darker areas. You can see how I left some slivers of paper unpainted in the tree trunk for that textured effect. And then I finish up by painting in some teeny tiny sections of branches that I would be able to see through these gaps in the leaves. Once I'm done, I switch on over to my size 6 round brush and it's time to paint in that grass under the trees. So first I create a mixture of undersea green with a little bit of new gamboge just so that I can go in with a slightly lighter version of my undersea green initially and I can build darker areas over that. I'm always looking to develop somewhat of a range of values everywhere throughout the piece because I know that this is the way that I can create a sense of dimension. And the undersea green is a pretty dark green in and of itself. If I go in with that right off the bat, my entire grass area will likely lack dimension and it'll look too dark. And that's it. That's all I'm gonna do for the grass. I'm gonna allow this to dry completely before moving on to the next phase. Once everything is bone dry, it's time to develop some darker values in the trees. Watercolor is always going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet, and so sometimes you might want to work on a second layer to develop even more of a three-dimensional look to whatever you're painting. Many watercolor artists work in just one single layer, and these trees look fine the way that they are because I made sure to develop a wide range of values in my first layer. And you can decide to leave your trees as they are, and that's perfectly okay. But I want to push forward today to show you and explain what I would do if I wanted to push the contrast more and I wanted to add in a few more details. For this phase, I make sure to have my fine water spritzer bottle on hand, and I'm going back to my size 6 round brush. Now the objective with this layer is to darken darkest midtones and darkest dark areas. I am not touching any of the lighter areas. So I'm making sure to prepare more of the color mixtures that I was using for midtone and darkest areas in that first layer, which were my quinacridone burnt orange, my burnt umber, and my burnt umber plus ultramarine blue mix. I make sure that these puddles have a coffee consistency on my palette. So more or less 50% paint, 50% water. Once I have those puddles on my palette ready to go, I start doing pre-wetting with my fine mister bottle, spritzing water all throughout my watercolor sheet, focusing on the leaf area of these trees. I hold my bottle at around 45-degree angle from my paper and do my spritzing maybe 7 to 8 inches away from my sheet. Once I see that nice even sheen, it's time to start deepening and darkening those darker midtones and darkest dark areas. Starting with my quinacridone burnt orange, and I'm also bringing in the plain burnt umber and burnt umber plus ultramarine blue in this tree in the front. I do make sure not to go overboard with my middle colors and the darkest colors in this tree because I still want it to look lighter overall when I see it next to the other tree. And then I move on to the tree in the back. But when it comes to the tree in the back, I jump right in with my burnt umber and then I move on to the burnt umber plus ultramarine blue. As you can see, I am not touching the lighter midtones and lightest light areas. I do not want to darken those areas because if I get rid of my lightest values, the tree is going to become heavy and it's going to lack dimension at the end. We need those lighter values. Once I'm done pushing those darker areas, I switch on over to my size 3 round brush and I'm gonna add in a little bit more detail using my quinacridone burnt orange and burnt umber, pressing down just the tip of my brush along the edges of my tree shapes just here and there to enhance the illusion of little leaves along those edges. It helps create more irregularity, and because everything is still wet, you can see how I'm arriving at these soft effects. I also go in to push the shadow areas in my tree trunk and branches a little bit more, continuing to use my size 3 round brush and using more short vertical strokes in these areas. And by this point, I'm using my burnt umber plus ultramarine blue for those darker shadow shapes. Then I allow everything to dry completely one last time, and it is finally time to add in those branches and final details wet on dry. For my branches, I am using my size 3 round brush and my burnt umber, making sure that I'm using just the tip of my brush so that those branches can look very, very narrow and fine and also tapered at the end. I am visualizing how these branches would look as they are extending away from the central trunk. The angle is very important. Also, as you're painting your branches, make sure that you're skipping over certain leaf sections so that it can look like certain parts of that branch are being covered up by leaves. If you're having trouble visualizing those branches, I would recommend sketching them in pencil first before actually painting them in. Just make sure that everything is completely dry and that you keep your pencil work as light as possible. And then finally, I go in to do some gentle bouncing to create more defined leaf shapes with just the tip of my brush. Because I'm using a round brush, it'll naturally create a teardrop shape, which looks like little teeny tiny leaves. For those leaves, I'm using either my quinacridone burnt orange or my burnt umber. And I'm just making sure to cluster these little leaf shapes together in different ways, changing their angle and adding in a lot of variety. A little bit goes a long way, so don't go overboard. And I use the same technique to add a little bit more detail right above the grass shape. Of course, for that, I use my undersea green. And with that, we're all done with these watercolor fall trees. Thank you so much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.